Hi everyone, so here is our final lesson, annotating the last half of follower. We're going to carry on with what we were working on last lesson. So we're focusing on the final three stanzas. We looked at the first three stanzas yesterday and we focused on how they really hyperbolically portray the father as this hero, this person that is so incredibly admired by the son, and it kind of his life goal is to be like him. Um, for me, the second half of the poem, we have a shift, and we're focusing a lot more explicitly on the child, the son in the poem, the Heaney figure. So we're going to have a look at these final stanzas now. I stumbled in his hobnailed wake, fell sometimes on the polished sod. Sometimes he rode me on his back, dipping and rising to his plod. I wanted to grow up and plough, to close one eye, stiffen my arm. All I ever did was follow his broad shadow round the farm. I was a nuisance, tripping, falling, yapping always. But today it is my father who keeps stumbling behind me and will not go away. Okay, so stanza 4, let's have a look at this stanza. So remember, this is the shift to the focus on the son figure in the poem, and moving away from the admiration of the father. That verb stumbled gives us that really stark contrast between the skill that we saw his father being described as having repeatedly through the first half of the poem, to him. He's clumsy, he doesn't have that natural skill that his father seems to have. And this is going to present a problem. This is what he's supposed to do. This isn't just that he admires his dad and wants to be like his dad as a child. The expectation is that he will grow up and be a farmer just like his father. And here we've kind of been given a problem. Here's the issue that we need to resolve. He's not as good as his dad. How is that going to work? Stumbled in his hobnailed wake. So that's referring to the fact that he's wearing hobnailed boots. They're boots with like reinforced toes. If you drop stuff on your foot, you get to look manly, like it doesn't hurt you. So it's reinforcing that he's the worker, and in the space behind him, his son is just falling over. Wake is the term for the movement of the water directly behind the boat. So this is more of our nautical metaphor again. Remember, that's all the way through this extended metaphor to describe the skill of his father. So his dad's walking ahead, and behind him, following, he is the follower at this point, he's just falling, stumbling behind him. We get this shift where he says, sometimes he rode me on his back. So he seems incredibly tolerant, like a lovely father. He's not bothered that his son doesn't seem to have the skill that he has. He's just like, it doesn't matter. And he puts him on his back and he takes him around and he carries on and does the things with him. In this line, there's something about the fact that the phrasing makes the dad the active one in the sentence. So in a sentence, we'd have a subject and a verb, and we might expect the subject and verb to be, I rode on his back. I think that would be the normal thing that I would expect. That's the normal phrasing that I would expect. I rode on his back. But instead of that, Armitage just flipped it, and it's sometimes he rode me on his back. And so in that sense, it's almost like the dad does everything, like he's the one who has the verb, even though we might normally reverse that. It really emphasises how passive the son is, utterly skillless, not even able to properly ride on his back. It's like his dad has to take control of it. His dad even has to do that. I've probably not explained that clearly because it's a sort of weird point that I always just see it in that line. But it's just the sense that he takes the active lead on the verb as opposed to the son, which is what we might have expected. Dipping and rising is more of those nautical ideas, like a boat would dip and rise. And it's like, I always think here, this is he's on his back, and so his head's going to be pretty much at the same level of his dad, and this is him sort of almost literally walking in his footsteps. He's seeing the world exactly the way his dad does, from exactly the same perspective. He's copying his dad's movement. It's like when he's riding on his back, he's imagining being him. Like we've got that real sense of this is what it would be like, this is what it would feel like if I were him. And so in this fourth stanza, there's still that deep admiration, but we've just had this sort of introduction of his feelings that he's in some way a failure, that his dad has got all this skill and he's so admired and so incredibly skilled and such an expert. And then when we think about him, he lacks all of those skills. He is falling over, tripping. He's not got this same potential that his dad has. Okay, stanza 5. I wanted to grow up and play. So I think we got the sense of that all the way through, but here it's just clearly articulated. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to grow up and be just like my dad. Close one eye, stiffen my arm, mirror those movements. That's exactly what he wanted to do. Now we know that Heaney grows up to be a poet, not a farmer, and a very successful poet. But we also know that he talks regularly about the feeling that he lets his family down in some way. That even though this is like an amazing career, imagine being a poet, how lovely. And there aren't many people who get to do that for a living, and Heaney does and is successful. But he feels that he lets his family down because he's supposed to be a farmer. All I ever did was follow in his broad shadow round the farm. So we're linking back to that title. All I ever did was follow. And we've got this sense of bathos. Now, bathos is kind of an anticlimax, I guess. Like we might have been building towards here. We could have had a sentence that focuses on him developing his skills. As he gets older, he becomes more skillful. He gets better. He becomes the farmer, and that might be the climax. That might be the thing that we want to get in the poem. But Heaney doesn't give us that. Instead, he gives us this bathos, this anticlimax, all this stuff about how good his dad is, and then ultimately all he ever does, and that's cumulative throughout his life. All he feels he ever does is follow. He can never live up to his dad. He can never be a leader. He can never have the skill that his dad had. He is just a follower, and all he achieves in the whole of his life is to just walk behind his dad and not live up to his expectations, or not live up to his own expectations of what he wants to be when he grows older. I think the broad shadow works on a couple of levels. I think physically it shows the scale of him. He's a big man. He's a big, strong man with an enormous shadow. But also, following in somebody's shadow is metaphorically never quite living up to them. And I think that's absolutely what he feels about himself in relation to his father at this point, that he'll never quite live up to being anywhere near as good as his dad as a farmer. I personally don't sense that there's any way in which the dad is judging him. I don't think we don't get the feeling of the father feeling disappointed with his son here. I don't see any evidence of that. I think this is a self-reflection. He feels that he's rubbish in comparison to his dad. He feels that he lets his family down. I don't think we get the sense that his dad ever treats him in that way. In the previous stanza, we had how tolerant he was. When his son kept falling over, he'd just pick him up and carry him on his back and look after him. So I don't think there's a sense that this is his father's feelings. I think this is totally the speaker's feelings here, that he's never going to live up to his dad. Okay, I was a nuisance. Tripping, falling, yapping, always. I think Heaney just wants us to be totally clear with this repeated use of verbs in particular, of how physically clumsy and incompetent he was in comparison to his dad. He couldn't keep up with him. There's a real juxtaposition, a real strong juxtaposition between the skill of the father and his lack of skill. His dad's this agricultural master, and he's really not. He's a noob. That's what young people say. He's a noob. He calls himself a nuisance. I don't feel that's what his dad's saying. Now, you can disagree. That's the joy of poetry. It's so ambiguous. I don't sense that that's his father telling us that he's a nuisance. I think that's his own feelings. He might think his dad thinks that, but I don't think his dad articulates that to him. If I'm totally, that's my personal opinion. We've got the series of present participle verbs. So we had that in Mother Any Distance, where we've got like recording and measuring, reporting, and those kind of things. And here it gives a sense of endlessness. That he's always tripping, like all the time, all throughout his childhood. He was tripping and falling and yapping, and it was happening all the time, regularly, constantly going on. I think there's a subtle zoomorphism in yapping. Makes him seem like a little dog, an irritating little dog. I don't think yapping is a nice noise. So there's a sense that he feels that he was just irritating his dad all the time, trying to follow him around, trying to live up to it, never actually achieving it, and just being incompetent and irritating. That's what he thinks he was to his father. Right, in that second line, but today, that word but, the conjunction or the connective but, comes after a caesura, so we've got a pause, and this just shifts us totally into the present tense. A lot of this poem is written in the past tense. It's about a memory, about reflecting on his childhood and what his father was like. And here we move into the present tense, but today. And at that point, this is something called a volta. So if we have a turning point where something changes in a poem, we call it a volta. It only applies to poetry, it doesn't apply to other texts. But in a poem, it's called a volta. And for me, that word but, that connective but, is the volta in this poem. But today, it is my father who keeps stumbling behind me and will not go away. I think that's a line that people struggle with. It's an upsetting way to speak about his father. He talks about his dad as stumbling, and that mirrors the way he was earlier on. In his childhood, he was the one that stumbled, and now his father stumbles. And his father stumbles not because he is suddenly, he's lost all of his skill. What's actually happened is he's lost his skill through age, and he's stumbling behind him because he's now an old man, and he can't keep up, and he can't move in the way that he did before. So in this, there's a comment in that verb stumbling. I think there's a comment on age and what happens to us as we age, and kind of the cycle of life, and how things change, and the things that we lose as we grow older, and the skill that he had, that real precision that he had, is now gone because he's a lot older. Will not go away. That's the bit that people find difficult. Now, I suspect this is a frustration. It is difficult to look after older people. Does he feel that he's had to adopt this carer role? Does he just want to leave all that behind because of his success? We don't know. It's quite a difficult line. It sort of jars that feeling that now, even though his dad was patient with him and tolerant with him, he doesn't feel the same in response to that. So yeah, that's the sort of difficult line. I watched an interview with him once where he talked about this poem, and he said that his family never really came to readings, so he used to do these readings of his poems, particularly his early works, when he was trying to kind of promote himself. And he used to do these readings, and he did one in Ireland, and he was reading Follower, and when he got to this final stanza, he looked up in the room, and at the back he realised his dad was standing in the room, and he'd never come to a reading before, and he just spotted him in the back of the room just as he was reading Follower. And he said he read the final stanza of the poem, and he watched his dad just leave the room, and they never spoke about it again. So I think there's a real sense that this is a very personal poem, and a poem that's really close to him, and these are feelings that he's sharing, even though they're quite upsetting possibly, or quite jarring. They are real, honest feelings that he wanted to share with people. Yeah, so there's this sense of this real strong emotions that we get all the way through this poem. So it's a loving relationship, but we've got lots of other feelings going on that are quite complicated in this poem. Okay, so we looked at the title in the last session, just quickly going to look at it again. So we know that follower for the first part of the stanza is about the father being the leader and the son just following behind and never living up to his expectations. But I think that final stanza, or the last couple of lines of that final stanza, flip that. And so follower becomes more ambiguous. Is the title talking about the son as a follower, or is the title talking about the father as a follower? It's probably both, but it becomes more ambiguous the more you know the poem. Okay, structure. So often the best place to start with structure is to think about how many lines there are in each stanza and whether or not this is consistent all the way through. And this poem is very neat and very orderly, and it's got 6 stanzas arranged into conventional rhyming quatrains, so 4 lines. I think that this structure represents the structure of his life. The expectation that he was going to grow up and be a farmer, that he's sort of fixed and set in stone, but also the precision of his father as a plougher. We talked a lot about the enjambed lines that reflect the movement of the plough, and I think this perfect structure is representing the furrows that the plough makes in the field, and it's like really, really tightly controlled and precise all the way through to reflect that skill and that expertise. Okay, now you've annotated your copy of the poem, please send me a photo of your poem. I really love looking at them. The ones I got for Mother in a Distance were beautiful, really, really impressive stuff. But if you could just take a photo of it and submit it to me on Satchel One, that would make me a happy English teacher. Thank you.